I'm here with L.P. Hoffman, author of The Canaan Creed. This is a fast-paced literary mystery suspense novel that deals with a murder in Maine, wolves in Wyoming, and a fugitive. It is one life-changing summer for wolf biologist Anna O'Neill. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you.
Tell me a little bit about yourself.
I'd be glad to. I'm a third-generation Wyoming native who grew up with the National Forest and Yellowstone as my backyard. I have my early memories are filled with rodeos and swimming at the Old Demoros hot springs and lots of family gatherings. I used to go fly fishing with my grandpa, who also gave me a deep appreciation for this land. He filled my head with stories at a young age of local characters, including Buffalo Bill. So my imagination was primed at an early age. When I was 12 years old, my family moved to Maracaibo, Venezuela, and then as a teenager in the mid-'70s, we moved again to Beirut, Lebanon, and right into the midst of a civil war. What an eye-opener that was.
What inspired you to write The Canaan Creed?
Well, the idea for the story came to me when I was sitting in on a wolf reintroduction meeting in my hometown of Cody, Wyoming. It was a lot like the one I described in my book. To my neighbors, wolves were seen as another excuse for limiting access to the federal lands, so, as you might imagine, it was a heated and emotionally charged meeting. But their fear and suspicion wasn't entirely without reason. In Wyoming, where 50% of the land is owned by the federal government, the people had in the past been deeply impacted by a lot of bad policies, and some of these had been pushed through by environmental litigation. So that day, I watched the wolf reintroduction meeting with some understanding of how the process works. I understood because I had been on both sides of this fence. I was once a founding member of an environmental group that came together to stop an oil well from being drilled near Yellowstone. I have no regrets about taking that stand, but then in the wake of that issue, I noticed something strange. It seemed to me like our little organization began to seek out new environmental issues and feed on controversy, and I felt that people were being pushed around. So I decided to step back and observe for a while. Some years later, my husband was appointed to serve as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Interior in Washington, D.C., and I was in a unique position to witness the vindictive side of the radical environmental movement. I realized that the ultimate objective of some of these groups is not to conserve and manage, but to use political power and our legal system to halt use altogether. So, to answer your question, I wrote The Canaan Creed because I care about the land, the wildlife, and the people. And I don't believe the three are mutually exclusive. I hope this story will give voice to Americans who've been harmed by the bad policies that are out there or disenfranchised by the political process itself.
I noted a religious thread that runs through The Canaan Creed. Can you comment on that?
I felt it was important to include this element in the storyline for several reasons. First, to raise awareness to the fact that some radical environmental groups are motivated by core religious ideologies. And second, I wanted to set the record straight on a myth that has often been advanced by these groups. You see, Christians are not the cause of environmental woes. The problem is greed and unethical behavior, and frankly, there's plenty of blame to go around.
What are your thoughts on the environmental movement?
I believe we need to conserve wildlife and protect the environment. There's no doubt about it. The environmental movement has served us well in raising public awareness. In fact, according to polls, most Americans now consider themselves to be environmentalists, and we can thank the environmental movement for that. I know I consider myself to be one, but there is also a growing skepticism out there. If we're going to move forward, I believe we need to address the fact that some things have changed. The reality is this. Environmentalism has moved beyond its romantic grassroots beginnings, and it's become an industry unto itself.
Can you elaborate on that?
Okay, well, for example, today many environmental groups have become huge organizations, and some of these are funded by the industrialists, the very ones they used to hate. As a whole, the environmental coffers have more money than both the Republican and the Democratic National Committees put together. Just think of the political influence there.
You sound a bit anti-environment.
Oh, not at all. But as with any political power base, there should be checks and balances. We're dealing with human nature here, after all. All I'm trying to say is this. Before you throw your support behind any organization, do your homework. Look for groups that are doing work on the ground and that include the local community in the process, and be very wary of those who are anti-human, use scare tactics and litigation.
Can you give our listeners a brief overview of the Canaan Creed?
Sure. The heroine in this story is a wolf biologist named Anna O'Neill. She's involved in the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone National Park, and as such has become a rising star in the environmental movement. After receiving an international award for her work, Anna discovers her father's body at their family's island off the coast of Maine. As the murder investigation continues, Anna returns to her home in Cedar Ridge, Wyoming. And there the reader gets to know a variety of down-home Western characters. Let's see, there's a local dude rancher who vanishes in the wake of another suspicious death, a logger who is frustrated by forest closures. There's a couple who run a ma-and-pa business that's plagued by vandalism. And then, to top it all off, the pages are filled with the community tensions between environmentalists, local folks, and high society outsiders moving into the area. Meanwhile, Anna is still trying to sort out her father's murder, her work reintroducing wolves, and the hypocrisy of her own overzealous environmental group. Then, she receives a mysterious document called the Canaan Creed. Suddenly, the playing field changes. Anna's life is threatened, and she escapes into the wilderness, where she does a lot of soul-searching. In the end, I'd like to point out that Anna remains a committed conservationist, but her eyes are open to a broader environmental ethic, one that includes people.
Where did you learn to write?
That's a good question. Well, I believe I was born to be a writer. I wrote my first short story when I was in grade school, and I can still remember empathizing with the characters' emotions and visualizing the setting. It was almost as if I was there myself. It was very exciting to realize that I could actually put it down on paper. I'm an observer by nature, maybe a bit of a hermit, but I do feel things deeply, and I long to touch others through the written expression. I like to think of writing as painting with words, and I have a lot of pictures in my head to draw from. Like my trips to the wilderness hunting camps with my husband and the travel to Europe and China. We have toured the U.S. in the old converted school bus, and we've dined with heads of state. My life's been a big adventure. As for the discipline of writing, I've taken courses, studied piles of books, attended conferences, classes, joined writers' groups, but for the most part, I have to say I'm self-taught and I'm still learning. I like to quote from a Willie Nelson song. We received our education in the cities of the nation, me and Paul. That's my husband's name.
How would you describe your style of writing?
My literary brand is characterized by 3 elements. First, I work very hard to make my writing tight and concise. Mark Twain described this discipline when he said, "If I had more time, I'd write less." Next, I combine a multiple third-person viewpoint into a braided plot chain to build suspense. I think this method works best to propel the reader through to the end. And lastly, I write about culturally relevant, sometimes controversial issues, as you may well have already guessed. Many of these deal with the struggles that I've personally experienced.
Can the reader expect more books from L.P. Hoffman?
Most definitely. I've written 2 other novels which deal with different subjects altogether, and I've got more stories in my head. I hope to entertain the readers and fill space on bookshelves for many years to come.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks for having me.